Sup y'all, DSnyds here to give you the gist of what you need to know about the 2020 History AP exams, which will all be on a single DBQ. Now I'm going to be starting with some essential information about the exam dates, the exact format, what you need, what units the exam will cover, as well as the advice that I'll give you on taking notes and maintaining academic honesty. But if you want to just skip to where I get down to brass tacks about the DBQ, I have timestamps down in the description. Now, before we begin, I would recommend writing a lot of this stuff down. So when are the exam dates? If you can take a look at the table, you can see that Euro is on Wednesday, May 13th, A-Push on Friday, May 15th, and WAP Modern will be Thursday, May 21st. And in that case, it's going to start at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can see right there on the table. Be mindful you're going to need to log on about 30 minutes prior to access the online testing system and set yourself up. Now, in the case you have a conflict or if something goes wrong with your submission, there are makeup dates. For Euro, it's Tuesday, June 2nd. For A-Push, Wednesday, June 3rd. And for WAP, you have Friday, June 5th. Now, be aware there's going to be a lot of nerves on that day, so be early and be prepared. In late April, supposedly, College Board should have a simulated online test site available so we can see for ourselves and practice when that time comes. In the meantime, y'all need to practice on your own. Prepare as you would for the day of the exam and organize your space. So what is the exam format? It will be one DBQ, that is a document-based question. You will have 45 minutes from start to finish, plus 5 minutes to upload your work. Of course, if you are approved for extra time, that will be factored in for you. This year, 2020, the DBQ will consist of 5 documents, unlike 7 in the past. Also, unlike in past years, instead of a 7-point rubric, this year will feature a 10-point rubric. Stay tuned because more on that is coming up. There will be a timer on the screen for the exam, and students can scroll through the prompt and the documents. Now, I am unsure if the documents can be printed, so check AP Central for more updates on that. Now, what do you need to take the 2020 AP exams? Preferably a reliable laptop, and one that you have used extensively. This is not the time to try out new equipment.
You went into battle with an unproven rifle.
You may use multiple devices if you want. For example, you could have the prompt on an iPad and write the essay on a laptop. Just some friendly advice, less is more. Now, you can handwrite your essay and upload the pics. If you have poor handwriting, this is not the option for you. Just be grateful that you can type this year. Keep in mind, you would need to send your essay to the device where you open the actual exam. So I recommend that you actually have a flash drive available just as a backup, just in case. So which units are on the exam? For Euro, it's units 1 through 7, and that excludes 8 and 9, so from 1450 to 1914. For A-Push, you have units 3 through 7, and that excludes units 1 and 2. But students can use that content for context. And also 8 and 9 are excluded, so this exam covers 1754 to 1945. And for WAP Modern, we're talking about units 1 through 6, which excludes 7, 8, and 9. And so that goes from 1200 to 1900. Another question, is the exam open note? Yes, since it will be online, and you very well may be taking it from home. Now this may sound awesome, but beware. In my experience, most students score worse on open note assessments, and this has to do with psychology. See, many students figure that they don't need to study as much since they have the resources available. You still need to study a lot. Do not forget there is a strict time limit. From start to finish, you have 45 minutes. So do not rely on notes, your textbook, or the internet. You simply just do not have enough time. And also, the question will be designed specifically, so you can't just find the answer in a textbook or online. So then the question is, can you use anything? Sure, timelines are preferential. They are visual and can convey a lot of information quickly. However, you should create your own so that you understand and remember the structure and the specifics that you put together yourself. And remember, less is more. Use the timeline as a trigger so then you can remember more information that you've already learned. Okay, now here's a tough question. Should you cheat?
You kidding me?
No. Do not even attempt to commit any degree of academic dishonesty, vis-a-vis cheat. Now, you should have a solid moral compass anyway, so do not phone a friend or work in groups, as if you have any kind of exact or similar answers, you could get flagged. Now, if you are caught with cheating, it will be reported to any school where you want to send SAT or AP scores, and reports will be kept on file. As we understand it, the College Board software will authenticate you to detect for any impersonation. You may have a series of questions that you must answer. They also have plagiarism detection software, kind of like Turnitin. So cheaters will likely lose and lose big.
You will lose.
To understand how seriously the College Board takes exam security, refer to this statement. At a minimum, test takers should understand that those attempting to gain an unfair advantage will either be blocked from testing, or their AP scores will be canceled, and their high school will be notified, as will colleges or other organizations to which the student has already sent any College Board scores, including SAT scores. And they may be prohibited from taking a future advanced placement exam, as well as the SAT subject tests, or CLAP assessments. So how about some DBQ tips? No? Still no? Sorry, dad joke. Okay, so who is the intended audience? Now you may initially say, oh, it's an AP reader. But in actuality, it is an educated bum. Now hear me out. It's somebody who is knowledgeable of general information, but unknowledgeable of your specific topic. As the writer, you must convince the reader that you know what you are talking about. So another tip is RTFQ. Read the friggin' question and understand what it is asking. And this is only second to ATFQ. Answer the friggin' question. Now, when looking at a question, be mindful of the thinking skill. So you have compare and contrast, you have cause and effect, and you also have continuity and change over time. Now keep this in mind, you're only going to have one or the other. So you're not going to have to compare and contrast, but it will be compare or contrast. So consider this question from the 2015 WAP exam. Clearly, it requires you to analyze responses, which means you are to focus solely on effects. Now, of course, notice it did not specifically say effects, but responses is synonymous. Now, you may also see words like similarities, differences, actions, reactions. It may also require you to analyze issues, analyze attitudes, or analyze relationships. It may also require you to evaluate the extent to which something occurs. So be used to any kind of this wording, but it always goes back to the thinking skill. Also, pay attention to how the question categorizes the task. The question may narrow your focus socially, politically, or economically. As you can see, this question just asks you to analyze responses. Of course, the documents will help narrow your focus, but a helpful acronym to use is SPIRE. Now, many educators use similar tactics. The acronym may be SPICES or Persia or ESPN. But this is effective because it helps you think of a wide range of categories, if none is specified. So SPIRE could help you think of multiple categories, multiple ways to answer the friggin' question. Also, if you're stuck and let's say the question asks to focus on economic issues, you can turn a social or political issue into an economic one, but it must be specific and purposeful. For example, you could write about a political decision that resulted in an economic consequence. Also, be careful to note the time period. In this question, you can see it specifies the early 20th century. You should really jot it down somewhere so you're very cognizant of it. This is again where a timeline will be extremely useful. Of course, not this particular one, and seeing as the 2020 exam will only cover information for WAP into 1900, this question wouldn't be asked anyhow, but I digress. Now, after you closely read the question, you need to quickly pivot to analyze the documents. Remember, there will be 5 documents on the exam, and you should take somewhere around 10 minutes to thoroughly analyze them, but certainly less than 15 minutes. The first thing to do for each doc is to look at the source, which will be at the top. This will have important information such as the author, the doc description, the date, and often some other relevant data. This will be especially important when it comes to any visual documents, which out of the 5, you can expect at least 1. Since the latest redesign, there has been exactly 1 visual doc on each exam, so expect an image, a map, a chart, or something to that effect. After the 2019 exam, I can remember students coming to me and saying, DSnyds, one of the docs was just this black box. Now, I understand the confusion if there really was no source. Take a look here. This is how they described it to me. Just a big black box. Now, this is the actual image that there was on the exam. Oh, and look, here's the actual document. So the question asked how the Portuguese transformed maritime trade in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. And upon reading the source, you can see how this document could actually be relevant. So remember, there will always be a source, and it is almost always important. All right. While you are analyzing the docs, you're going to need to briefly outline what you will include in the DBQ. Now, I know many of you will say, I don't have time for an outline, but hear me out. Provided it is brief and to the point, and that it relates to the prompt, you will usually save time and earn more points. A good outline, some pre-writing, will help make connections in your brain and will get those creative juices flowing. Just think, how many times have you been writing and then you go off into a tangent? Now you think you're on task, but you're not, and now you've just wasted a whole lot of time. Remember, you're either stepping forward or you're stepping backward. You're never stepping sideways. What I mean is that every sentence you write is either getting you closer to answering the friggin' question or moving you away from it. Either the sentence helps or it distracts. There is no in between. So a good outline is concise and does not contain full sentences. Write in blurbs. Jot down main ideas and key concepts, and be sure they all relate to the prompt. And again, we don't know if you'll be able to print the documents. And what happens if your printer goes on the fritz on the day of the exam? This year, more than ever, an outline will be of paramount importance. Now, while you are outlining and annotating, be mindful of which elements of apps you would use for each document. APPS stands for audience, purpose, point of view, and situation. Now, I'll explain these with a little bit more detail later on, but this is vitally important to do while you are analyzing the docs. You will also need to figure out how to group your documents into 2 categories. The reason why you do this is so that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. That way, if one of your arguments is not as strong, you have another to fall back on. Remember the earlier prompt. Analyze responses to what? The spread of influenza in the 20th century. Look for connections. Remember the acronym I gave you earlier, SPIRE, S-P-I-R-E. This could be extremely helpful in grouping the documents. For instance, depending on the documents, you could group according to social responses or political responses. You could also look at positive versus negative responses, effective versus ineffective. Just remember, and I cannot emphasize this enough, always consider the prompt. ATFQ, answer the friggin' question. Now keep in mind, you don't need to create a table like this, but sometimes a graphic organizer can help. Now, just analyzing in one supporting paragraph may earn some points, but just listing document after document, not very effective. It's certainly not AP quality. It's not restaurant quality writing. Okay, let's break down the 2020 DBQ rubric and briefly explain all the elements. I will go over this rubric point by point. Now, this is not from College Board directly. This is my own structure, but all the points and wording are identical. So let's get started. The good news is the introduction is exactly the same as it has been for years. It consists of a thesis and the contextualization. Now, you can begin with either the thesis or contextualization, but in this example, I'll start with the thesis. State your historically defensible, all-encompassing thesis that responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt. However, you do want to use the language of the prompt. It must establish a line of reasoning, so remember, ATFQ, answer the friggin' question. Consider how you will group your documents to preferably make 2 arguments. If you have a good outline, you will have already decided this. Don't simply list, but connect all major points to be discussed in the body paragraphs, in 1 to as many as 3 sentences. Develop your points sufficiently. Very important, she must be present. You must include specific historical evidence, SHE. She must be present. Remember, y'all, this is a social science thesis, so it must be specific. We're not talking about the English style thesis, which is more general. So here's an example of a thesis from the prompt I showed you before. In the early 20th century, there were political and social responses to the spread of influenza. Survey says, this is a typical thesis attempt that is way too vague. Now note, English writing is more about style over substance, whereas social science writing is more about substance over style. We want you to use effective language. Do not be verbose. All right, so how should you structure the thesis? Now, especially for this year, here is a formula. This is not the end-all be-all, but it should help put all the pieces together. Since the thesis statement should be self-contained, start with the time period followed by your two arguments. Remember not to simply list them. It's just not a name drop. But fully develop your arguments. And remember, she, specific historical evidence. Then finish it off if you need to with the result. So how can we improve on this lame thesis? How about this? In the early 20th century, governments issued quarantines and restrictive laws to stop the spread of influenza. Additionally, people labored and volunteered to help those who were infected. However, despite these efforts, the pandemic continued to spread on a global scale. As a self-contained thesis, it starts with the time period, followed by the first argument with specifics, then the second argument also with specifics, and ending with the result. This would earn the point for the thesis. Now, I have trained my students throughout the year to parenthetically list which docs will be used to defend each major argument, and I have also asked them to underline their thesis statement, so I know what they think their thesis is. Now, you can do this if you want, but it is not required. Okay, moving on to contextualization. Now, technically, the contextualization can occur during the time frame of the question or after, but we put it in the intro because it almost always only earns the points there. The information included in the contextualization cannot be repeated later in the essay for credit. So again, that is why we place it in the introduction. Okay, so think of this as a V formation, where you go from the broad to the specific. The first sentence should be a broad statement about the historical events, developments, or processes that occurred just before the topic of the prompt. Now, how far back should you go? Well, it depends on the overall time frame of the prompt, but for WAP and for Euro, usually no more than 100 to 200 years at the most. And for APUSH, it's usually around a century or even less than that. Now keep in mind, those are just general suggestions, they are not hard breakpoints. The successive sentences should offer more detail, but do not provide superfluous information. That means unnecessary or disjointed facts. Provide background information, the 4 W's, who, what, when, and where. You must include at least one specific historical example, such as a person, place, or event. Remember, she must be present. You need to sufficiently describe the example. Do not simply identify. And this is incredibly important. It must relate to the prompt. It must connect to the argument. I mean, just because you're mentioning something that happened earlier doesn't mean that you're answering the friggin' question. So let's look at the question again and check this out. Sometimes they may offer some background information about the prompt. If they provide this, you better pay attention to it. It could be a text or a map, as you see here. Notice the question requires you to analyze responses to the spread of influenza. Well, since this is asking about effects, a logical focus for the contextualization would be causes for the spread. Now, here's a few examples. You could discuss World War I. Now, keep in mind, it must be relevant. So you could go on and on about the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, but what does that have to do with the spread of influenza? Nada. So get to the point. Now try this on for size. You could mention that the soldiers were in the trenches and in close proximity to each other, spreading the disease. And that's a good start, but it only gets you halfway. Notice the map. You have to explain how it spread to a global scale. So you could mention troop deployment, sick soldiers being cared for, and then other people getting sick, contagious diffusion. You could also explain the impact of industrialization, but remember to be specific and on point. So, you could discuss the steam engine and how steamships allowed people to travel farther and faster, enabling diseased people to live long enough so that they could infect other people in distant regions. You see the connection? One final suggestion could be imperialism, as the map clearly indicates that some documents originated from European colonies. And since trade between these places would be more intense, that would have facilitated the spread of influenza. Okay, enough of that. Very important, do not discuss the documents in the contextualization, because you will only get credit once when you introduce a document, so prevent yourself from stepping on your toes later on. Furthermore, if you're explaining an event that occurred before the start of the documents, then this is not an issue to begin with. Okay, I heard this really well explained one time from a colleague, so thank you, Ms. Carbs. To conceptualize this, think of the Star Wars crawl. Now, hopefully your parents raised you right and that you know what I'm talking about. But before any Star Wars film, they provide background information right up to the beginning of the movie. Another way to think about this, if you were trying to prepare someone to watch Avengers Endgame who hadn't watched any of the previous Avengers films, what brief important information would you tell them? Well, probably a lot of it would come from Infinity War, the movie that directly preceded Endgame. Now, if you haven't watched any of these movies, then I don't know. I got nothing. So now let's get into the supporting paragraphs, the meat and potatoes of your essay. And if you do a proficient job on the intro, that's 2 points. As you can see highlighted, there are some changes to this year's rubric, including more point opportunities than in previous years. First off, begin each supporting paragraph with a topic sentence. This lets the reader know exactly which part of the thesis you are addressing. Now let's tackle the evidence from the docs and look at one of the easiest points on the rubric. You must use the content of at least 2 documents to address the topic of the prompt. So provide a 1-sentence summary with specifics from the doc. You can include more than 1 sentence if you feel you need to, but remember, time is a big factor. Remember, do not quote the docs, as there is no value added. It is a waste of time because the quotation cannot speak for itself.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And since you need to successfully summarize the content of 2 documents to earn the point, I suggest you attempt this at least 3 times, in case one isn't up to par. Now, a logical progression of thought from the summary is to follow that with the sourcing of the document. This is appsing the document, where you explain how the audience, purpose, point of view, or situation is relevant to the argument. Make sure you understand what I just said. I emphasized or. Only do 1 task per document. And notice the rubric. You can earn 2 points by sourcing 2 different documents. And as I suggested before, you should attempt this at least 3 times in case one isn't up to snuff. Bear in mind, you will not earn the point by just identifying. A lot of students miss out on this because they do not finish their thought. You need to explain how or why the audience, purpose, point of view, or situation provides value to the document, and why you can use it as evidence. To provide some guidance, for audience, you need to address for whom was the doc written. For our question, it's different if the document is from a civilian girl talking about volunteering to help out her local community, or if the doc is from a military doctor reporting on death tolls. Obviously, you can see a difference there. For purpose, you need to address why was the doc written. Many students fail to do this properly. Be mindful, okay? The reader is not looking for what it says, but what it did. What was the intended purpose of the document when it was created, and what was it meant for? Next up, POV, the point of view. In this case, you need to address why did they say what they said? And furthermore, why is this important? If the document contained detailed information about numbers of deaths related to influenza from a military base, and it is from the point of view of a military doctor, you can infer that the information is most likely reliable. You could also write about the situation, meaning what was occurring during the time of the doc. Of course, this must be relevant to the prompt. Now let me just say this. I will explain later how you need to incorporate the situation anyhow. In fact, twice. While some teachers think the situation is a great way to earn the point for sourcing, my concern is that the student may be double dipping. This is an important point to make. You cannot earn multiple points for the same sentence. And that is for anywhere in the essay. All right, so if you're keeping score and you successfully sourced 2 documents, you're halfway there. Okay, looking at this part of the rubric again, you can earn another point by using the content of 2 documents to support your argument, to support your thesis. That, of course, answers the friggin' question. Now, you must address the specific information to explain how or why the document is useful in supporting your argument. You can earn an additional point by using 2 more documents to support your argument, for a grand total of 4 docs analyzed. Again, to be on the safe side, you could analyze all 5 documents. So this is where you need to strategize while writing. Because of the time constraint, you need to determine which points you will prioritize. Now, to offer some advice as to how you could structure these elements, here is a basic formula. You write in document 1, or whichever document you're writing about, and then you write your detailed summary of the document's content. Then you address apps. So you could write the purpose of this document 1 is, and then you'll be followed by your analysis to the relevancy of the document. Then you would follow it up by writing this supports the argument that, and then you can explain how the document and the source supports your argument. And you repeat these steps for every document. Now, since you shouldn't source every document, you can simply leave that step out. Be sure you are describing the contents of the document and then explain how it is relevant to your argument. Now I get this. It sounds formulaic, and it is. This is not exactly sexy writing. But remember, you are composing your essay for the purpose of completing tasks and earning points. That said, good writing is good writing, so be as creative as you can with the time you have. On that note, keep in mind, the readers know this is your first draft, sometimes a very rough draft. So we know that this is not going to be the most polished essay that you're capable of producing. All right, there are still 3 more points available on the 2020 DBQ rubric. For one supporting paragraph, or perhaps in a separate paragraph, you must describe the historical situation beyond what is found in the documents. Typically, the situation is happening concurrently within the time frame of the question. And of course, this must be relevant to an argument about the prompt. Now, this specific historical evidence, person, place, or event, must be different from the evidence used to earn the point for contextualization. And it must be more than simply a phrase or a reference. You need to thoroughly explain your point. So a good conceptual formula to follow for the situation is to include she, the specific historical example, and then you explain what it is. Remember, your audience is the educated bum. And then you connect the example to your argument. And you can do this a second time for an additional point. So remember what we used for the contextualization? Now, this might not always work, but some contextual examples can extend into the time of your essay. In fact, all of these could work for the situation. Of course, once again, you cannot double dip with contextualization, so this gives more credence to the value of outlining properly and efficiently. So if you used evidence of troop movements during World War I in the contextualization, you could write about industrialization and imperialism for 2 situation points, or anything that works. So then there was one. Now, this is what I like to call the complexity point. Okay, real talk. My advice, especially for this year, consider this task as optional. Only attempt it if you have the time and you can clearly see a connection. Furthermore, attempt only if you have been slaying essays all year. If writing is your kung fu and you love a challenge, then go for it. For one supporting paragraph or in a separate paragraph, you can analyze the argument and demonstrate your understanding of the historical development by bringing the essay to another level. Now, you can do this in a plethora of ways. You can explain both elements of the same skill, so for example, cause and effect. You can explain connections within and across time periods. So, for example, perhaps compare responses to the Spanish flu with responses to the Black Death. You can corroborate multiple perspectives across themes, analyze multiple variables, or modify the argument by considering diverse or alternative views or evidence. Now, this is typically the hardest point to earn on the whole rubric, so honestly, attempt this only if your entire essay is completed. Okay, so there you have it, the 2020 History DBQ explained in a nutshell. Now, as an added bonus, it's time for a snide remark. Now, even though this is not part of the rubric, I recommend, if you have the time, to include a brief conclusion. Now, let me explain. This is not another full paragraph, but what you do is restate your thesis, but do not rewrite verbatim. You see, as luck would have it, you usually have a clear idea of what your arguments are after writing the essay, and you can only earn the thesis point in the intro or in the conclusion. Now, this is, of course, optional, and only do this if you have the time. And seeing how the majority of you will perhaps be typing this anyway, you could go back to the intro and spruce up your original thesis as well. But regardless, use effective language and always answer the friggin' question. Okay, well, thank you for watching. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. And while you're at it, feel free to subscribe because it really helps my channel. This represents a tremendous time commitment, and these videos don't make themselves. All right, everybody, from the bottom of my heart, have a day. DSnyds out.